On a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey, buried under the dirt for more than 10,000 years, sits a ring of giant stone pillars that should not exist. They should not exist because of when they were built. Not hundreds of years before the pyramids. Not 1,000 years before Stonehenge. Try 6,000 years before Stonehenge. This place was already ancient, already buried and forgotten, before the first stone of the first pyramid was ever cut. It was raised by people who had no writing, no metal, no wheel, no pottery, and, as far as we knew, no reason and no ability to build anything like it at all. This is Gobekli Tepe. And when archaeologists understood what they were looking at, it did not just add a chapter to the story of civilization. It tore up the first page. For a century, the story we told ourselves went like this. First, humans learned to farm. Farming gave us surplus food, and surplus food gave us cities, and cities gave us priests, temples, and monuments. Religion and grand architecture came last, once we were settled and fed. Gobekli Tepe says that story is backwards. So sit with three questions. How could hunter-gatherers, people with stone tools who chased wild animals for a living, quarry, carve, and raise stone pillars weighing as much as a truck? Why would they build a monument this enormous before they had farms, villages, or a single domesticated crop? And strangest of all, why, after generations of work, did they deliberately bury the whole thing and walk away? Because the answers we are finding do not make the puzzle smaller. They make it larger. Every pillar lifted out of that hill pushes the origins of organized religion, monumental building, and human ambition further back in time than we ever dared to imagine, into an age we had written off as primitive. The people we pictured as simple cavemen turn out to have been architects, artists, and engineers, working on a scale that would not be matched for thousands of years. This is the story of Gobekli Tepe, the temple that came before history. Chapter The Impossible Date. To understand why this hill shattered the timeline, you have to sit with the numbers, because the numbers are almost hard to believe. The oldest monumental structures at Gobekli Tepe date to around 9,600 years before the Common Era. That is more than 11,500 years ago. Stonehenge is about 5,000 years old. The Great Pyramid of Giza is about 4,500 years old. Gobekli Tepe is roughly twice as old as both of them. When the pyramids were being built, Gobekli Tepe was already a ruin more ancient to the Egyptians than the Egyptians are to us. Now line that date up against the story of human progress, and the problem jumps out at you. 11,500 years ago, there was no such thing as a city. There were no farms. Agriculture had not been invented. Human beings lived as they had for hundreds of thousands of years, in small mobile bands, hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. They had not domesticated a single crop or a single animal. They had no writing to plan with, no metal tools to cut with, no wheels or carts to haul with, and no pottery to store food in. By every rule we thought we understood, these people should not have been building anything. A monument like Gobekli Tepe was supposed to require a settled society, organized labor, food surplus, and central authority, all the things that only come after farming. And yet here it is. Massive, deliberate, and thousands of years too early. When the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in 1994, he understood almost at once what he was holding. Local farmers had known for years that the hill was full of stones, and an earlier survey had dismissed them as a medieval cemetery. Schmidt looked closer and realized the truth. These were not gravestones. They were the tops of enormous carved pillars, from the very dawn of the human story. He is said to have known, on that first day, that he would spend the rest of his life on this hill. He did. The dates are not a guess. Archaeologists have been able to pin them down partly because of how the site was preserved, using radiocarbon dating on material sealed inside the structures. The results kept coming back with the same staggering answer, again and again. This was real. This was the 10th millennium before the Common Era. And the site is far larger than the small area that has been dug. Ground-penetrating surveys of the hill suggest that what has been excavated so far is only a fraction of the whole. Beneath the surface, geophysical scans have detected the outlines of many more of these great stone enclosures, perhaps 15 or 20 in total, most of them still sleeping under the earth. Gobekli Tepe is not a single ring of stones. It is a buried complex, most of which no living person has ever seen. And the closer they looked, the stranger it became. Because Gobekli Tepe was not a village that happened to have a temple. As far as anyone can tell, no one lived here at all. Archaeologists found no houses, no hearths for family cooking, no ordinary signs of daily domestic life inside the enclosures. What they found instead pointed to gathering, ritual, and feasting. Gobekli Tepe was not somewhere people lived. It was somewhere they came. Chapter The Temple of the Hunters. Walk into what has been uncovered at Gobekli Tepe and you find a series of great oval enclosures, rings of stone set into the hillside. And standing in those rings are the pillars. They are shaped like a capital letter T, a tall vertical shaft with a wide slab across the top, and they are big. The largest stand around 5.5 meters tall, roughly the height of a 2-story building, and weigh somewhere between 10 and 20 tons each. Each enclosure has a ring of these T-pillars around its edge, with 2 even larger pillars standing alone in the center, facing each other like silent giants. And they are not blank. Their surfaces crawl with carvings. Foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, spiders, wild birds, cranes and vultures, all rendered in stone with real skill. In places the animals stand out in raised relief, as if climbing the pillars. There are carved arms and hands wrapping around the sides of the central pillars, and belts and loincloths carved at their base, which tells us something remarkable. These T-shaped stones are not just abstract. They are bodies. They are stylized human, or more than human, figures. Towering stone beings, gathered in a ring, watching over whatever happened in that space. And some of the carvings feel almost deliberately mysterious. On one now famous pillar, a stone panel is crowded with creatures, a scorpion, snakes, wild birds, and above them a vulture with a wing that seems to reach out toward a strange round shape, like a ball or a disc. People have argued for years about what the scene means, whether it records a myth, a ritual, the dead being carried into the sky, or the night sky itself. The honest answer is that we do not know. We are looking at the symbols of a religion whose gods, stories, and names are completely lost to us, carved by hands that vanished 12,000 years ago. Now hold the date in your mind again while you look at them. The people who made these were hunter-gatherers. They had no metal. Every one of those pillars was quarried from the surrounding limestone bedrock using tools of stone. Workers hammered and scraped the rock with harder stones, cut the pillars free, shaped them, carved the fine details of a fox's snarl or a vulture's wing, and then moved objects weighing as much as several cars across the ground and stood them upright in prepared sockets. With no wheel, no draft animals, no iron chisel. Just stone, muscle, rope, timber, and an astonishing amount of coordinated human effort. That effort is the second shock of Gobekli Tepe. Raising even one of these enclosures would have taken hundreds of people, working together, over long periods. Hunter-gatherer bands are usually small and scattered, a few dozen people at most. To quarry and raise Gobekli Tepe, large numbers of them had to come together, in one place, and be organized, and be fed, long enough to move mountains of stone. And they did it again and again, building enclosure after enclosure over centuries. And this was not a one-time miracle by a single lucky genius. The enclosures were built, used, and then covered, and new ones were raised, across many generations. That means the knowledge of how to quarry, carve, and lift these giants was passed down, parent to child, for hundreds of years, along with whatever beliefs made the whole effort feel necessary. Somewhere out on that landscape, an entire tradition of monument building was alive and thriving, at a time when, according to our textbooks, humanity had barely taken its first steps out of the Stone Age. Which raises the obvious question. What could possibly be worth all of that, to people who did not even have a permanent home? The temple that built the world. Here is where Gobekli Tepe stops being just an old ruin and becomes one of the most important puzzles in all of archaeology. Remember the old story. Farming first, then villages, then, much later, temples and monuments. Gobekli Tepe flips it. Here is a monument, a place that looks overwhelmingly like a temple, a ritual center, built by people who had not yet started farming. The gathering place comes first. The grand architecture comes first. Agriculture comes after. And that leads to a genuinely radical idea, one that Klaus Schmidt himself helped put forward. What if it was not farming that created religion, but religion that created farming? Follow the logic, because it is beautiful. Imagine scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who share a set of beliefs, and who gather, at certain times, at a sacred hilltop to build and worship together. To raise those pillars, hundreds of people have to stay in one place for weeks or months. All those people have to eat. Hunting and gathering alone may not be enough to feed such a crowd, in one spot, for that long. So the pressure builds to find new ways to produce more food, reliably, near the sacred site. And it may be no accident that some of the earliest evidence anywhere for the domestication of wild wheat comes from a mountain range within sight of Gobekli Tepe. In this view, the need to feed the temple builders may have been one of the sparks that pushed humanity toward agriculture. We did not settle down and then, once comfortable, invent gods. We may have come together for our gods, and then had to invent farming to survive the gathering. If that is even partly true, then civilization itself, the whole world of farms and cities and everything that followed, may have been born, in part, from the desire to build something like Gobekli Tepe. And the wheat is not a small detail. Genetic studies of domesticated einkorn wheat, one of the very first crops humans ever grew, have traced its wild ancestor back to the slopes of a mountain called Karakadag, which rises only a short distance from Gobekli Tepe. So at almost the same time, and in almost the same place, two of the most important things that ever happened to our species appear side by side. The first great monuments, and the first farming. To find them together, here, at the very beginning, feels less and less like a coincidence the longer you look at it. It is important to be honest here. This is a theory, and archaeologists still argue about it fiercely. Newer discoveries suggest the picture is more complicated, that there may have been more settled life around the site than Schmidt first thought. But even in the most cautious reading, the core shock remains. At Gobekli Tepe, monumental sacred architecture and the first steps toward farming are tangled together at the very beginning, thousands of years before they were ever supposed to meet. The buried secret. And now the strangest part of all, the detail that turns Gobekli Tepe from a mystery into a genuine enigma. They buried it. At some point, thousands of years after they began, the people connected to Gobekli Tepe did not simply abandon the site and let it fall into ruin. They appear to have deliberately, carefully filled it in. The great enclosures were packed with rubble, stone chips, animal bones, and earth, until the giant pillars were completely covered and the whole complex vanished under an artificial hill. In fact, the modern name Gobekli Tepe means, roughly, potbelly hill, describing the rounded mound that this burial created. The hill itself is, in part, something they built on top of what they built. Think about how strange that is. This was not a natural collapse. Someone chose to take the greatest structure their world had ever produced, the labor of generations, and entomb it by hand. And because they did, they accidentally preserved it. The very act of burying Gobekli Tepe is why it survived, almost intact, for over 10,000 years, waiting under the dirt until 1994. But why? Why bury your own temple? We do not know. Perhaps it had served its purpose and had to be ritually retired, put to rest like a body. Perhaps a set of beliefs died, or changed, and the old sacred place had to be sealed away. Perhaps the burial itself was the final, greatest act of devotion. We are reading the mind of people who left us no words at all, only stone and silence. And whoever did it was thorough. The fill was not a thin layer of windblown dust that gathered over centuries. It was a deliberate mass of debris, tens of thousands of fragments of stone and bone, carried in and packed around the pillars on purpose, deep enough to swallow monuments taller than a house. That is an enormous amount of work in its own right, almost a second construction project laid on top of the first, whose only goal was to make the temple disappear. To bury Gobekli Tepe may have taken nearly as much effort as it took to raise it. And here is the humbling truth. After decades of work, only a small fraction of Gobekli Tepe has been excavated. Ground surveys suggest that many more enclosures and pillars still lie buried beneath the hill, untouched. And Gobekli Tepe is not even alone. Nearby, at sites like Karahan Tepe, archaeologists are uncovering more of these strange, ancient sanctuaries, hinting at an entire lost culture of monument builders at the very dawn of the human story, most of it still under the ground. So we are left standing on a hill in Turkey, looking at giant carved figures raised by hunters 12,000 years ago, for reasons we can only guess at, and then hidden from the world by the very people who made them. Gobekli Tepe was built before farming, before cities, before writing, before history itself. It should not exist. And yet it does, quietly rewriting the story of who we are, and how far back the human urge to gather, to carve, and to reach for something greater than ourselves truly goes. For 10,000 years, this hill kept its secret in perfect silence, a lost cathedral of the Stone Age, sealed by the hands that built it. Now, at last, it is speaking again, and every word it says makes our own story older, stranger, and far more mysterious than we ever believed. The people who raised these stones buried their temple and vanished. But the questions they left standing in that ring of silent giants are only just beginning to be asked.